I think now we move on to the next speaker and then the discussion of the student.
Thank you, sir. Our next speaker today is Dr. Sohini Saha. She's an assistant professor at the Department of Sociology, Xavier's College, Kolkata. She's a visiting faculty at the Department of Sociology, Jadavpur University. Her dissertation has been on male body and masculinity, an exploration of the band committees and akharas of Kolkata. Her research interests lie in the field of gender studies, masculinity studies, sexuality studies, sociology and anthropology of the body, of health, Urdu poetry, politics and resistance. She has over 10 years of teaching experience at the undergraduate, postgraduate and research levels and has published widely in national and international journals. She also writes for online platforms like Ground Zero and Cafe Dissensus. Please, madam, I request you to now take it.
Thank you so much. I will actually take it from Kolkata, sir, and just proceed from there. Interrogating my concern would be to interrogate alternative, the term itself, alternative masculinities, particularly, and I will do so through the idea through female impersonation. So I will look into Jawahar Khadwi, the Jawahar Khadwi's life and their performance, and try to understand what happens when one enters into the realm of performance, like Chatra, playing the role of a woman, and the kind of transformation and the negotiation of masculinity that one got into the man's life, for that matter. To begin with, to talk about alternative masculinity is interesting because the alternative is always in relation to the hegemonic. So there is a current trend, I would say, to also see alternative masculinity through an idea of benevolence, because it critiques the hegemonic. But what is left unsaid or uninterrogated is that the alternative masculinity does not do away with the question of power. So when we talk about alternative masculinity, what is this alternative, and why is it still masculinity, and how and where do we exactly place the masculinities, for that matter? What is masculine about masculinities if it deviates from the hegemonic, for that matter? And there I come in that even the ideas of masculinity obviously changes, but what doesn't change is this very idea and concept of being a man. So if I can put it in this manner, that it's very interesting that earlier the idea of masculinity was based on controlling women. That is what we knew about hegemonic masculinity, controlling, restricting women. But today, masculinity is also about being a man who enables women, who allows women. Who, similarly, earlier patriarchal ideas structured our idea of manhood. Today, the feminist ideas. If you become a feminist man, then you also gain a certain kind of power in terms of a different idea of manhood. In that sense, we see that what we usually term as alternative masculinity, picking up feminist ideas, etc., also grounded in an idea of power. Power never goes away. Power is retained, but in different contexts. So how do we look into this alternative idea of masculinity? That's my question. Even in context of Dalit masculinity, which you see, there is a very interesting quote by Shantanu Shekhara, who talks about how Dalit masculinity in the Bhim army is challenging the very idea of Brahmanical masculinity. But if you read further, you will find that there is a very unique power relation that comes in. As much as the Dalit masculinity of the Bhim army is challenging the power of Brahmanical masculinity, it also retains its power vis-a-vis counterposing itself against femininity of women, where the Dalit men becomes the protector of Dalit women, for that matter. Especially this also comes in context of keeping a mustache. You see the not allowing the husband to keep a moustache is basically an act of feminizing them. But the claim to keeping a moustache is also a claim to a masculinity that is denied. But that masculinity is also dependent upon a rejection of feminization, which again talks about the hierarchy of the masculine and the feminine that is retained within the correct masculinities context. In such a context, how do we understand the alternative? Therefore, I try to embark on that journey through female impersonation. And in this context, I take up Choudhury Bhaduri's life and journey. And I'm basically basing itself in two things, primarily mostly secondary materials, not only works that has happened on Choudhury Bhaduri, but also the documentary by Naveen Kishore, performing the goddess, as well as many interviews that have come online in the previous year. Now, we know that Choudhury Bhaduri, as a female impersonator, started working in jatras at the age of 18, where they were offered female roles, and they started, performing as a woman. And while they were performing as a woman, they dedicated a lot of time to this, dedicated themselves to playing Choudhury Rani. But this transformation from Choudhury Bhaduri to Choudhury Rani also brought in a transformation within themselves, where they started identifying themselves as a woman. And very interestingly, at a certain point of time, later part of their life, if we now go back to Choudhury Bhaduri no longer identifies themselves as a woman anymore. There is further a transformation where they have gone back to becoming a man. So this is a very interesting journey, and this complexities of the journey also talks about the complexity of female impersonators venturing into playing the role of the other and becoming the other, and what does that becoming entail, and what it does mean to actually again come back being a man, and why. So if we, so I will divide my presentation in three parts. Firstly, trying to understand Choudhury Bhaduri to Choudhury Rani. And there are different instances. If we go to Naveen Kishore's documentary, Naveen Kishore opens us the very first scene where we see Choudhury Bhaduri is transforming themselves into Choudhury Rani. And that transformation, and immediately after that transformation, where they have become the woman, particularly playing the role of goddess Shitola, we see Choudhury Bhaduri again in kurta pajama sitting and is being interviewed. And in this documentary, we get to see, and Choudhury Bhaduri enacts the very first moment where they got the opportunity to play the role. And here there is a distance that they draw. They say that there was a shock and fear and hesitation to play the woman. And it's very interesting because this enacts a form of masculinity also, that how can I become the woman for that matter when I am a man. So this is how Choudhury Bhaduri narrates, and then he is being told that yes, you can be a woman, we will give you these props, etc. And then they start with that. So this very initial distance, I believe, it's also a way of doing masculinity, whereby establishing oneself, vis-a-vis establishing the woman as the other. How can I play the woman? The Choudhury Bhaduri is trying to also enact a form of masculinity in that sense. And there also the class angle comes up very significantly, because I have to understand Choudhury Bhaduri also as a marginalized man in terms of caste and class identity. When they say I didn't have anything to do, I had to take up the role of a woman. So it's like a kind of, they are being forced also because of their financial conditions. These are the two things that they mention in different interviews as well as in the documentary. It's very interesting. That is how they enter into playing the role of a woman, which also shows that they are not already considering themselves as a woman, but enters into this difference. And drawing is very important because later on they start identifying themselves as a woman after playing, and not already being a woman who is taking up the woman's role. So it's very interesting that this is how they begin entering. And there are two processes. I can just give two examples of how they become the woman, not just on stage, but also off stage. One moment is for the audiences, that because Choudhury Bhaduri used to play goddess Shitola in Jatra Palas. So there is one moment when the woman, after the performance, would come to Choudhury Bhaduri to apply sindoor or vermilion. And Choudhury Bhaduri will say, see, I am actually not a woman, so I cannot apply. So because it is a heteronormative norm, you can apply vermilion. And the women will say, no, you are women for us. You are the goddess. So in spite of their quote unquote main identity as a man, the woman sees them as the goddess. And that is a kind of a becoming that also takes place on stage as well as off stage. Because remember, this is not a performance, it's outside the performance. So Chapel Bhagwan is performing, the woman is also outflowing outside, post-performance also. This also happens for Chapel Bhagwan themselves. How I narrate this from the documentary itself, that Chapel Bhagwan starts feeling like a woman. We would often say that I would go through this phase of feeling like a woman. In the beginning of the month, I will feel weak. So it's like replicating the period of menstruation that the woman goes through. And so we sort of see this kind of an embodiment of womanhood, one can say, that comes up. So it's not only the person is performing, but the body is also performing. There is a performed sense that Chapel Bhagwan has. Performing self and perform self, there is a performing body and performing body. But the body is also not just fixed in ontological, where we talk about the male body, but the male body is also trying to embody certain things and feel like a woman, experience like a woman. The body is also undergoing certain form of changes. This also happens when, in one of the very interesting, an example that incident that Chapel Bhagwan shares in the documentary, and also in other interviews also they have often shared, is that once they have completed the done a Chandrapala, and they were moving out from front stage to backstage, and at that moment some men came in and thought that they were a woman, and they started kidnapping Chapel Bhagwan. And of course other people came in and decided to say that, oh, this is why are you kidnapping? This is actually a man, so why are you kidnapping that person? And that became a chaotic situation, but Chapel Bhagwan was saved. But that day, Chapel Bhagwan, something else happened. Chapel Bhagwan developed a heightened sense of feminine consciousness. So they would say that every time when we go out, from next day, from front stage to backstage, I will also be a bit cautious. I will be a bit careful of what is there, etc. And this consciousness, this care, is also female consciousness, feminine consciousness, I would say, that people who recognize themselves as women also important. So we know that when we go out in public spaces, we are also afraid, fearful of sexual assault, etc. And that is something very interesting. That is the experience of women who identify themselves as women. So it's very interesting how the female, quote-unquote, female body fear that we experience, or the feminine body fear that we experience, is also embodied, started to be embodied by Bhagwan. And it is important because it causes a disjuncture. Something, the female body fear is now being embodied in a male body. So this is how they also start feeling like a woman also, and not just performing. And that Chapel Rani is also not just in these moments, but also when Ravi Kishore makes us a documentary into the everyday life of Chapel Bhagwan. We see a person who is basically wearing kurta pajamas, but the way the gestures are of Chapel Rani particularly. So there is a very interesting mix of Chapel Bhagwan. We see for Chapel Bhagwan. Chapel Bhagwan does not go away, but Chapel Rani is already setting in. And so it's a very interesting idea that making of Chapel Rani is the unbecoming of Chapel Bhagwan. And yet the unbecoming and the becoming of merges, and we don't understand whether it's the unbecoming of Chapel Bhagwan or the becoming of Chapel Rani, because Chapel Bhagwan never fades away. Chapel Rani slowly comes into how we see Chapel Bhagwan for that matter. And that is, I think, a moment of queerness that I'm trying to point out. And if we now move on to a later part of their life, where they have identified themselves as a woman, entered into a sexual relationship with a man, and spent certain part of their life identifying themselves as a woman. But later part of their life, when we see their interviews, we see that they identify themselves as a man. So I'm talking about interviews that are also online. There is a Shobhanji face-off, then there is a Imami Art program of their documentary screening that is there in 2022 also. And in these documentaries and in this screening programs and these post-screening discussions, whenever Chapel Bhagwan is asked, they identify themselves as a man. And they also try to see themselves. So when the interviewer asks every time that, now how do you see yourself? And they say that I am a man. There was a moment in me, but it was only safely situated during the time that they were performing as a woman. And so now we see Chopra Bhavri no longer identifying themselves as a woman, but have now seen the woman in the only as a part of the performance and an effect of the performance. Now, it's very interesting because when you read the documentary earlier, Chopra Bhavri only tried to narrate their sense in terms of a woman that was already in there. So, throughout the documentary of Naveen Kushal, Chopra Bhavri gives us many examples of how they had the woman in them for a very long time. So, they would give examples from childhood, etc., as a way to consolidate a very stable identity. Later part also, even though Chopra Bhavri's narrative changes and they identify themselves as a woman, man, there is also a tendency to also solidify that identity, where they always claim that I've always been a man. So womanhood is only an effect of performance. But what does that narrative do also is to tell us that indeed Chopra Bhavri's performing as a woman is basically performative in nature. If you see in true Bhavrian sense, that to become the other, performing as a woman also transforms their sense of self. And later part, when we come back to being a man, how do we understand that? So we see Chopra Bhavri often narrating how they are a man now. So one of the examples, for example, they would often refer and again they mentioned that they were never comfortable with playing the woman's role, and they would distance themselves from that, and thereby create a distance that I have entered into playing a woman's role. Similarly, they would also highlight the power of performance, because one of the reasons why Chopra Bhavri is so popular is because they used to play a woman being a man. So to be able to play the other is also praiseworthy, because you are playing something that you are not, and that shows about the efficiency of the performance. So here the performing aspects is more highlighted, and they would often give example of how Uttam Kumar couldn't recognize them as a man, and they would actually consider them as a woman. And when Uttam Kumar came to know that it was actually a man playing a woman, Uttam Kumar actually praised Chopra Bhavri. So these examples are also a way to understand how Chopra Bhavri distances themselves also from an intrinsic womanhood in them to talk about the performing womanhood mostly, where performance reigns again supreme. And this is also a way of also doing a masculinity by also distancing oneself. So now Chopra Rani is only an art and not what one was at a certain point of time. Similarly, they would often narrate about referring to Mera. There was a time that they would identify themselves as May, that is woman. Now they would often say Mera, where the Ra is very insignificant because there is an otherizing narrative where they do not anymore see themselves as a woman. And they would often take away pro-feminist stance in saying that I have a lot of respect for women, and this pro-feminist stance also makes Chopra Bhavri someone who distances oneself from women by claiming that they are a man now, they have been playing a woman, but they respect women and they play by playing the womanhood or playing as a woman. They have actually tried to give expressions to women's expression to womenhood for that matter. So they become in that context and maintain a distance from womanhood and yet portray themselves as someone who is supportive of women, femininity, etc. So this is also a way of doing masculinity by in the current times when you take up this very pro-feminist idea of man, and also yet also distance yourself from not being a man, not being a woman for that matter. So this is the complexities through which we get to understand Chopra Bhavri towards the later part of their life, now when they do not identify themselves as a woman for that matter. And but if you ask me how do I narrate this, why would I talk about this playing of a man or masculinity? I'm trying to point out that I actually go back to 2016 when I witnessed Chopra Bhavri live at Presidency University. And that is a moment when I actually would like to think what Chopra Bhavri actually does. Very interestingly, in that performance, Chopra Bhavri dresses up as Shikala goddess and comes on stage and asks a very interesting question: who am I? So that is a later part of their life. When they say, who am I? I think that is a question that I want to keep, because through this transition, when people who try to reduce Chopra Bhavri to, okay, they have gone back to becoming a cisgender man again. That is a narrative that often comes out. But I want to also read this through the concept of Upantar that Chopra Bhavri has mentioned, and Anirban Datta has brought that concept in one of their work. where Chopal Khaduri has talked about change, transition in a different way, a more nuanced understanding of transition, where we have, and that was also enacted on stage that during the presidency, when Chopal Khaduri said, "Who am I?" And this question was not a question to answer back, because they couldn't interpret Khaduri back from this Shara system. That was actually a question I said, which actually overturned the very meaning of question. Because who am I is a question that people ask in order to know your gender. And there is an answer that the interdisciplinary order demands from you that you will answer back. But the question that Dr. Lakshmi said again and again, who am I, who am I? Everyone trying to figure out, okay, we'll answer. And actually, it was actually not to answer, it was actually to disrupt the very intelligible order on which this questioning rests. And they were also doing it, and they also tried to not only complicate this question itself, but also they performed something else. From Shitala, they transformed themselves into Bhagavati and on stage. And in spite of all the audiences, we knew obviously Chopal Khaduri is a major individual, but there was a fear, there was a horror in us. What will unfold when Chopal Khaduri is undressing themselves on stage? And in spite of knowing, we were very, in a kind of a tensed horror situation. Everyone was silent, and then we came back to becoming Chopal Khaduri. A transition. I think that is a very interesting transition that we did on stage. But what also happened with their life? Chopal Khaduri to Chopal Rani to Chopal Khaduri. One would say that, are they coming back to being a man? I would say it is basically Chopal Khaduri's concept of, or his way of looking into Rupantar, where they say that if I can change my route on stage every day, what is difficult in changing my body? So when they say that, they often narrate that the bodily changes, maybe in some case of transsexuality, etc., are also not fixed entities for that matter. So any form of transition from man to woman to get man to get woman is basically different forms of transition rather than trying to understand this transition through an idea of fixity. That, okay, I'm coming back to being a man. Oh, I'm going back because I have a woman in me earlier. But I think their life also tells us about the kinds of transitory nature that we see. So when Khaduri was sitting there, we could see the body, but the body was, they were claiming them to be a man, their attire was manly attire, but they were presenting themselves through a feminine voice, a feminine gesture, and thus I couldn't see Chopal Khaduri as neither a man nor a woman. Chopal Khaduri presented themselves as a queer person. I'm not saying queer as an identity, but queer as a politics, where you cannot define the identity of a person. You cannot say what is man or woman. So if you ask me, can I see Chopal Khaduri as an originating masculinity? I would say Chopal Khaduri, the way what I said today, was trying to understand that Chopal Khaduri disrupt the very idea of masculinity. So it's not about locating another form of masculinity, but complicating the very terms on which masculinity rests. And I think Chopal Khaduri was also trying to say through her life this very idea of the complexities of gender. That's right. Thank you.
So thank you so much. So now, like the two excellent papers, they are now open to questions, comments from you all.
We have one Marathi character, which was considered the heat transfers as a. I just like because in Tamasha, we need a man who has a feminine qualities, and he shows the feminine character in most of Tamasha and Marathi films. Right. And there's a movie called Anirban, and he performed the man of that Tamasha. So the question is, when he's transferring himself to perform as a female character, there is a social stigma which occurs with this character. And so he's unable to go back to his family. He's a real person. So I just want to ask you that how to deal with the idea of social stigma with this transferring from a masculine character to feminine character. Yeah. Because that's another important concern. Yes. There is another, which is always have a question. Probably that nowadays in Marathi series, we have a lot of combinations. When they are used like race or we call it cross-dressing. And is it this kind of a thing is it a very safe way of bringing vulgarity or jokes to the stage by wearing the line or what is how you can think of it because that's your area. Okay. So I just have these questions.
Thank you, ma'am. Firstly, I think yes, definitely there is a stigma in terms of becoming a woman. And John Harlan's life also we have seen that they have faced a lot of things for being a woman. Even today, they often talk about how they live in a old German middle class. What is their situation, etc. There have been many tensions that we have often narrated. So of course there is this stigma that is always there for the people who are playing female impersonators because they also bring in these qualities of feminine qualities that also stays back with them in that sense. But at the same time, it is also like also pointed out there are also ways of negotiations. So Kolkata also talks about being a man is going to be a woman that also becomes a kind of a way to express their performing self, how good a performer they are to be able to so flawlessly play. So there is a navigation that happens, both stigma and measures of power, how you navigate that. And in terms of cross-dressing, I think that the very fact that we consider it, like the society consider it as one, I have understood that there is an idea concern about vulgarity. But I think that the very idea that one sees it as a vulgarity, that is what has to be interrogated, right? So I think that when people are actually bringing in cross-dressing in that sense, I think that also challenges the different forms of conceptions that people have in terms of looking at cross-dressers as people who are vastly marginalized in different ways, etc. So I'd like to answer that. Thank you.
Yes.
No, there was an other one.
My question is, off late I have sensed a difference between Shakespearean cross-dressing and say Indian cross-dressing. In the case of Shakespeare, it is it's a kind of toying with sexuality and exploring all the gamuts without really running into the leeward side of law. But Indian cross-dressing, actually my paper is on Anirban films.
Okay.
And there, this is same girl, there is this Ramlila sequence.
Yes.
So there are certain aspects of Indian cross-dressing that are endorsed by religions.
Right.
And there is this song, Radhe Radhe Radhe, Tere Bina Krishna to Radhe Adhyat. You talked about Mashikana. So would you like to comment? The religious significance and whether it is being endorsed by society. Apart from sexuality, the other part.
Thank you for this question. Actually, I missed saying when I began that the very idea of playing Bodhisattva, the very act of playing Bodhisattva when impersonating women in Jatra, they actually come up from a position that of privilege of being a man also, because at that point of time when Chandra started, women were restricted from performing. So I think women playing, men playing the role of women in religious context, in Indian context, in Indian jatras and other kind of such Ramlilas, etc. They were particularly because women couldn't enter. So this was a man who basically have to be in act. So there is a kind of a privilege that a man can only occupy the sphere of performance for that public sphere. So of course there is a power in that, but it is also and then there is also acceptance also, because you see that because women are not allowed to perform on stage at that point of time. So that idea has continued. I don't know how far it is also continues today. But there was a time when I was talking about Rahul Gandhi and women were not allowed. So that was another context. But then again, that also is there is an acceptance of from the audience, because they also want to. There is a conception that women cannot perform on stage, so of course a man has to perform in that stage. But also that also comes with not only with power, but also with a kind of lack of power and disempowerment also, because the man is again being a woman and again becoming disempowered, one can say, in terms of the gender hierarchy. So what happens? So this is a kind of a very complex situation. So, but in terms of audience acceptance, if you see, the acceptance comes in because it's a religious occasion, a religious context. And also I feel that somewhere the performance of women is something that was restricted at a certain point of time, which made the acceptance by the audiences more, made it more acceptable for the audiences to take in men as playing the role of the woman. So that is how I would like to answer that.
Man playing a goddess is not a man playing a woman.
Right, absolutely, ma'am. And this is a very important point. I think that again, playing the goddess is again a powerful situation. Absolutely, absolutely. I agree, because that is also how one can see the relation of power also, that you are ultimately playing the gods and goddesses. Thank you, ma'am.
I also have this the text we were looking at, this is a Kishore
Documentary.
Mangesh is saying that he can't hear anything. Okay. I was just saying that your reading, the whole model is actually the documentary which has been produced by I mean, your reading of
Yes.
the whole model is actually the documentary which has been produced by Naveen Kishore.
Yes.
Right? So you're reading somebody else's somebody else's text.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So secondary source.
Yes. Also, I'm also reading his English.
Finish the question.
So reading somebody else's text, and also, this is something which I'm thinking about, that what kind of can we just impose theoretical frameworks? I mean, it's like suppose whether we become an and then also the larger history of Jatra.
Yes.
I mean, it's a text which is entrenched with certain kind of a historical situation. So can you actually give it a comment on that?
Yes. Thank you so much, ma'am, for this question. I think it's very pertinent. Definitely, my reading is all secondary, because I have never met Chapol Bhaduri, even though I have seen them perform. I have used also the interviews, but then again, there are also interviews in online videos. So as I already mentioned, these are all secondary reading of it. I've never been able to, but I'm hoping that I can, if I can ever interact with him, and I'm trying to do that. Also to get a primary conversations with him to bring more into this text. So that is definitely a lack, one can say, and definitely this is also just a reading of the documentary or the reading of the interviews that they have given, which are all secondary sources that are.
So I have a question regarding your own. Right? So something that is settled that it's not always obvious that, let's say, a feminine man is not the other. Right? These notions are, things that have to be settled at this point, right? So things like Mangesh said, and a man can also be a misogynist, he can also be a feminist. And the fact that the pro-feminist movement have had in world riots and massacres. So something that I wanted to ask you for a very long time is that have you found feminine expression, found different alternative expressions or even questions to masculine performances within your own work? And does that at all feed into this particular article or this particular work that you are presenting to us about trouble? So this is something that I want to ask, because and then Yarn is also a form of performance. So and trouble, as much as I've heard from my peer editors, has also been very misogynistic at very different points in time and very personal circles. Has also said many things which are very different from what they perform. And that brings in a complexity and you're questioning a lot of ontological and epistemological stances about Champol and Champol's performance. So what would you or your take on? So that is amazing. Thank you.
Thank you. So yes, as I was already mentioning actually, because when we talk about Chopal the later part, they have often distanced themselves from claiming to work for that matter. So, but I think portray themselves as pro-feminist. So, of course, in terms of understanding Chopal we may not be able to, like when we listen to him in different contexts where they have spoken online or their interviews. There is a biography also that has come up by Chopal. So in all these biographies, etc., they have different points of time. They have also not only brought in the side of the feminine side of it, but they have also brought in, as you have said, things that they have said or articulated, which also articulates a kind of masculinity, a kind of distance from woman, maybe also misogynist. I'm not exactly remembering anything as such as of now, but there might be. So I don't think that we can place Chopal outside of this idea, or we can, because they are always continuously negotiating their masculinity. So that is the complexity of the character also, what we can read from what is available to us in different books and articles and interviews and documentaries for that matter. So from that perspective, I would say that is the complexity. So I was trying to just read the complexity and trying to understand Chopal again, if we can understand from that one performance. The performance may not reflect what they are, quote unquote, but the performance also does something, and it makes us think about certain things. So I think that made me think in a way. So therefore, I took up that who am I as an important way. Even though later on Chopal has never spoken about that concept, they are not complicated, but it is my reading particularly. So what happens when someone says, who am I? And can we understand that as opening up a different way of thinking about gender, masculinity, etc. But Chopal might themselves not say that, might claim themselves to be a man. But can we also understand from different various moments and thereby also think about different ways of understanding masculinity or challenge to masculinity for that matter? Thank you.
I think just to tie into what everybody is saying, I mean, what I find interesting, and if you would want to expound on the politics of that, is that you use the pronoun they. And Chopal has always identified himself as a man. So, I mean, what is the politics of that? If you could just say.
Ma'am, thank you so much, because I was also, they have always identified as man. And so I was also
I mean, isn't that this also a form of cisgender? I mean, isn't this pleasing a form of? I mean,
yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Absolutely, ma'am. I think that is again the complexities, ma'am, because I remember that when I was reading one of the works on Chopal Bhaduri, it was referred to as a he. And then when I was reading another work by Anirban Datta, they preferred to call Rituparna Ghosh and Chopal Bhaduri as Z. So they were also trying to bring in a different way of, Yes, so in doing so. And so I think that is also a very interesting complexity that I also have. My mistake, I believe, is also the complexity of gender identity. That is also.
That politics should be laid bare first.
Yes, absolutely. So I was also very complicated that whether I should. So at a certain point of time, I refer to him as him when he's later part he's identifying as man. Then there was a part when Chopal Bhaduri to Chopal Rani, and if I see that in the documentary, I prefer to call that part as they, and then I come back to. So that is also complexity, and then I am also failing in that complexity. And that is also speaks about the politics of identification also. Thank you, ma'am.
There's one other person, no? There's another question.
Actually, this would have to be the last question, but the
She has been asking for.
Continue once we are there for the thing. I'm sure Madam will be with us for the tonight. Actually, my question is towards concerning also and it's not okay, fine. Actually, we have engaged in a very rich conversation, standard assessment. So here we have this new concept of digital space. Because we cannot leave out that space where that the performance of masculinity cannot be just restricted to the physical offline spaces, but also how it's being treated in the online platform. So now, with the recent trends, or we can see that those men's rights groups are very prominent now. Social media platforms and some space for now. I think those are kind of producing different ways towards seeing masculinity and amplify the anxiety around masculinity. And I feel there is actually, pushing those present masculinities towards extremism. So I just, one of the comments, like how to see your feature of masculinity in that space, because we can't live out that space. Yeah.
Yes, you want to respond to that?
I think Professor Kulkarni is there online.
Does he want to respond?
Professor Kulkarni, can you?
Yeah, I'm still here, but I could not hear you actually. As I could very clearly hear Professor Basu. After that, it's been very difficult.
Should I call the lady to put the question forth here?
No, you
Actually,
type
there's
the
another
question.
question here.
Just type the question.
I'll type the question.
Just type the question. It's just
Would you just come and type the question here? Because it's online, I think it would be better for you. Yeah, I think you can just speak from there. That should be okay.
But you can.
Yeah.
Are you audible, sir? I mean, am I audible?
Have you
I
put
can-
it on?
Yeah, it's on.
Can you use this one?
Sir, actually,
I can hear you.
yeah. Actually, we were speaking of diverse masculinities, as Professor Srimati Basu also mentioned about that. But we cannot leave out the digital space, like this digitization of masculinities, and we cannot. The performance of masculinities as we see is not limited to the offline physical space, but now it's being negotiated and constructed differently in the online spaces as well. So, how do you think that this new men's group, they're very prominent in various social media platforms, and I think it's producing a wave of anxiety around masculinities and how it's pushing already threatened masculinities towards extremism. So what is the future of that alternate space there in the digital era? If you could suggest something or comment on this. Thank you so much.
Actually, I couldn't. Initially, I could hear you clearly, but I only know that you have said something about the digital space, and then there's some sorts of debates or interventions there that you have tried to name, but I couldn't figure out what it is that you're naming.
No, there's a space called, they have that manosphere, like they have.
Oh, okay, I got it. I got it. Yes. Of course, I mean, that is part of what I meant, I meant by, that's terrible, that's growing. And actually, I can share with you, in fact, just the other day, I have downloaded an excellent article on this, which is just a state-of-art article, which I can, I'll send it to Professor Sathe, I think, whose email address I have. So you can look at it. It is a very detailed evidence-based kind of research on the manosphere, actually, and especially what you're calling, in the digital space. But broadly, the incel phenomenon, that. We have been seeing this for a long time. Though I'm not sure how this, whether, and to what extent it's happening in India, it's not very clear to me. But surely in the West, it has bulked large. There are, I think, also, I remember watching, was it either a movie or a web series on this? So yes, that is definitely a problem. That's part of what I have been, what I towards the end described as the backlash, the multi-pronged sort of backlash, right? So it's part of that. But also two other things very quickly I want to flag here, which I should have flagged earlier. One is I really don't know what to say, especially in the Indian context, about another kind of masculinity, if you like, which is this, trans men. And that has resulted in a big sort of debate in the West, particularly. You might know, giving access, particularly in terms of giving access to trans men to women's cisgender women's spaces and things like that. So that is one thing. And the second thing, very quickly, is there are men who seem to be slipping in and out of the gender identities. They have sort of, in a way, if you look at them, they were sort of basically males who also play that role, but suddenly also they decide that they are, on some days, they decide now, the person decides I'm a woman, and so on. And there is at least one case I know of a CEO, high profile, I'm talking of the West, a high profile CEO who actually even walked away with an award meant for women CEOs. Only on some days this person appears as a woman, and I'm sure the person has risen to that position because of the basically masculine identity and all the attendant advantages that it has. So the manosphere is of course a very large issue, no doubt, and I don't want to say anything that's very let's say, I don't want to sort of dismiss it by making just very quick remarks about it. I'll share with you this, I'll send this article and you can look into it. It's obviously a very worrisome phenomenon and it's part of a sort of backlash. And it, of course, like the men's rights movement, it also you can see there a certain kind of articulation of anxieties, and certain very deep disappointments and various kinds of dysphoria, which are genuinely at some level, felt and very. It's something very painful. It expresses a range of painful, negative emotions and so on. So it's something that has to be handled with care, I think. Yeah, so I don't want to say much more about it now.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
So just I'll give the prerogative of the chair. Just put it into words, because this was so very interesting things were being talked about. So I think one important thing that is coming up again and again is the need to think of fixities in resolution, where identities seem to be like absolutely resolved. They don't like stand anywhere. But still, how to think of hierarchies operating, how to think of actions which should act against hierarchies, or what to base that. So the seeming need of fixities in a resolution, that has been, I think, coming up again and again. Especially like in Mangesh's case, it was very interesting. He began with the discussion of how the whole thinking about masculinities in different ways is connected to feminism. And then again, at the end, he comes up to how the need to link one's position, however alternative it may seem, to the ethical and political positions of feminism. So that, I think, is one important aspect. And in Sohini's case, she has been talking about, I think she also began with something like, what is masculinity in alternative perspective? I would like if she came back to that, like because she was like talking about the performative aspect more at an individual level. Mangesh was speaking more at a social level, but in a way they complemented each other. These two talks. So again, I think this question remains: what is masculinity in alternative masculinities? And to think of how to think of fixities in the resolute field of identities, to think of about things. So, thank you.
Thank
you. I think go for last.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, madam, and thank you, Dr. Kolkata, for this very varied and thought-provoking session. we would now break for lunch. I request the participants to please go to the food court, which is to my left, and our guests are requested to proceed to the general staff room. Our member of the village secretary